Welcome to this episode of The Rabbit Hole, where we'll be talking about Japanese imperial ambitions that were bolstered by victories against the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War and Germany during World War One. Notably, both of these victories were during weak points in those nations' histories. This bolstered ultra-nationalist feelings in Japan and made ultra-nationalist forces such as the Kodoha or Toseiha very popular. These forces pushed Japan into more ultra-nationalist and expansionist fervours, thus an imperialist fervour. On top of this, external pressures such as the Lytton Report's lack of action and the 1924 Immigration Act of America made the Japanese public hate the West and want to expand their influence further, which we'll be talking about in two different points. Then we'll be wrapping up in what happened after, with the Muktin Incident, which started in 1931 and finishing this off in 1941, where Pearl Harbor began, thus the Americans joining the war. Welcome back. Let's get straight into it. The major things that pushed Japan into an imperialistic ambitions were two major factors, one of which I believe is the more important, which I'll be talking about first: the internal threats. These were mainly the ultranationalist groups such as the Toseiha, Kodoha, Black Dragon Society, Cherry Blossom Society, and Brotherhood of Blood. Yes, there's more, don't worry about it, they're all awful. These groups had varying different opinions on how they should make Japan better, but they, paraphrasing from The Rise of Militarists by Roland Doland and Robert Worden, paraphrasing, these small groups believed the West, thus democracy, were greedy and individualistic, and not in line with these ultranationalist groups, what the ultranationalist groups would call Japanese values. Japan's society became connected and cored by the ultranationalist groups. Positive or negative, these groups created a, quoting again from The Rise of the Militarists by Ronald Doland and Robert Worden, the 1930s were a decade of fear in Japan, characterized by a resurgence in right-wing patriotism. This right-wing patriotism was quite strong thanks to things such as the Great Depression, which made Japan in a desperate time, as many other nations, such as Germany or Italy, during these periods of stress and uncertainty, many people go to an extreme side of the political spectrum. In the case of Japan, the already strongly powered Japanese militarists and right-wing populism was strong enough that many chose the militarist factions instead of such things such as the communist parties. These internal ultranationalist forces wanted the emperor to rise in power thanks to stuff and attempted to expand influence, such as in Muktin Incident and the September 26th incidents, both controlled and implemented by two different militarist factions on completely separate grounds. This shows that even with the militarist, it was still making a destabilizing force in Japan. While doing these, they were trying to take more and more power from the political parties, creating a less democratic force, which they, as previously mentioned, despised. The 1930s fear was definitely sustained by multiple coups, notably the May 15th incident and the February 26th incident. The May 15th incident was notable as it was used by this ultranationalist group, the Brotherhood of Blood, as a platform to spread their feelings that they were just being loyal to the emperor and trying to show that they were truly loyal, which was effective, as in this period, Japan was very fervent about if you were doing something in the name of the emperor, you were doing the right thing. Even if you went around the wrong way, you were doing the right thing. So most of the time, these punishments were light. In the case of this trial with the Brotherhood of Blood, you had many, up to some sources that I've found say 110,000 letters and petitions sent by the public, written partially or mostly by their own blood. Even as well as nine other members of the public sent in severed their pinkies severed and pickled as a sign of sincerity that they should be tried instead. This trial became a wild show, used to create this ultranationalist feeling even worse off. The lessons would be learned in the February 26th incident, in which that time the public did not get to see the trial of these ultranationalists, but the damage was done. Because of these incidents, Japan became increasingly unstable and more, racist in their beliefs, seeing that they should be owning more land that they can spread their people in, noting they did it with Korea and has been treating Koreans horridly for decades at this point. Thus, the sense of the Muktin Incident would begin. This incident, which I'll go more in depth in the next part, was an incident that will create external pressures that will push Japan even more greed into making expansion. The red circle in the Japanese flag stands for the sun god Amaterasu, who is the ancestor to the Japanese monarchy? Oh. Hello, sorry. Welcome back to the rabbit hole where I got a haircut and, well, it's been a couple days, so let's continue on. So, when we last left off, Japan had become a militaristic state because of the lack of resistance to these militaristic elements who gained power and influence because of it. In this, the West and the rest of the world did nothing to hinder any effects or operations that Japan committed. This is most apparent in the 1931 incident in September 18th, 1931, known as the Muktin Incident. This was a false flag operation by the Japanese officers, completely independent of the main government, to take Manchuria from China. They planted bombs, failed to do their objective, but classified it as China attacking them and invaded Manchuria. After their invasion, the League of Nations initiated the Lytton Report to study and find out what the hell happened. They determined that Japan had committed a false flag operation to give an opportunity to invade. Thus, they found that Japan was guilty. What did they do? Nothing. Japan left the League of Nations and nothing was done about it. In this lack of resistance and any form of punishment, it's like placing a cookie jar in front of a kid, telling them not to eat it, they eat one, then you do nothing else. This created Japan a perfect point of continual expansion without repercussions. The same thing happened in Germany around the same period. So, welcome to my new board of stuff, as I ran out of space at my home office, as well as this is a school assignment, so I have to do some of these clips at school. So, yeah, welcome to this. So, last we left off, I was talking about how Japan had these external pressures that met little resistance. Now, in this part of this second part, don't worry about it. We're going to be talking about Japan's feelings of resentment with multiple nations from their external pressures. These include the Immigration Act of 1924 and restricted imports by the US on Japan. These were two separate events, of course. The Immigration Act made it extremely difficult and targeting Asian and Pacific Islanders. This would made it extremely hard to move to America. This, of course, annoyed the Japanese, even if only 156, give or take, Japanese civilians moved to Japan. Now, let me give you a quote. Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians, by which is this, but I can't pronounce it, so yeah. That exemplifies Japan's hatred to the West and their racism to most other peoples. Noting that quote is a well known phrase during the Meiji Restoration Boshin Wars era, where, so about 1850s, 1860s, but it's still to the point. Another point that really annoyed the Japanese people were, quoting again, yeah, no, heavy quotes, aren't we? There were attempts to establish a statement of racial equality in the Covenant of the League of Nations, but it was vetoed by the United States because of opposition in California and Great Britain, Australian resistance, notably the White Australia policy. This is another quote from Unleashing Force, the Racism section by Susan Townsend. This this whole thing really enraged the Japanese as they saw these great powers ignoring their pleas for racial equality, as well as other such things, such as the Washington Naval Treaty, if I remember correctly, restricting the size of ships and the number of ships for most of the world's navies, notably the US and Britain having the most size limit. Japan coming in second overall size limits. This felt enragement by the Japanese as military specifically, seeing this as giving the US and Britain an advantage which should not have been given. On top of this external pressure, we're going to also be talking really quickly about the Japanese racism to other races and how they saw the Western colonies. In this, Japan saw the Western colonies. I'll just give you a quote. Again, from Unleashing Force, Racism by Susan Townsend. While Asians, the Japanese saw themselves as less representation of Asia, rather more than Asia's champions. They sought to liberate Asian colonies from Westerners who they despised. Disdained, my apologies. So this quote is showing how, again, Japan's racism and feeling against the Western powers. They did not see themselves as, well, they saw themselves less as fellow Asians and more leaders of Asia. Similar to many racist white policies in our history, in world history, thinking of other lesser races, big quotation marks there, were needing of assistance because of lower intelligence. I gotta keep on putting quotes because, yikes, that stuff was messed up. Japan saw this in similarly, treating Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos. What else? We got Thai, Vietnamese, Singaporean, Indonesian, Papua New Guinean. All of these different ethnicities they saw as lesser, that they should be protecting weak these weak races, notably just not giving them the autonomy that those places they say claim to be giving. Let me give you a dramatized scene. We're flying to the Kido Butai, the first carrier division. With its flagship the Akagi, we fly into it and see the admiral's office. the young naval officers celebrating a successful attack against the Americans in Pearl Harbor. Yamato is at the head of the table, but he's not celebrating. He's sitting there quietly, quite somber. One of the officers asks, "What is wrong, Admiral Yamato?" He replies, "We have not succeeded. We have woken a sleeping giant." I should mention most of that is paraphrased as well as dramatized, as the quote with sleeping giant is no real credible sources that I can find about it, but it does encapsulate his feeling of, we just woke one of the biggest powers in the world and we weren't successful. His main target, leaving Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, was to take out the aircraft carriers. Halfway through the trip, he learned from command the aircraft carriers were not going to be there. He wanted to return. They denied and said that we have to do this now or never. So he went. It destroyed 13 ships, 3 of which were unrecoverable. Did not harm fuel reserves or the submarines in the harbor. All of these things, and Yamato felt that it was an unsuccessful attack. Quoting Bruce Robertson's Pearl Harbor Rude Awakening, "Operationally brilliant, the attack was nonetheless strategically disastrous." This is true. It was a brilliant idea to try and replicate the attack on Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War, take out in a surprise attack and stun the nation and break their moral spirit. Thing is, unlike Tsarist Russia, a country that was already unstable, America was not so unstable. Many were anti-war at the time, feeling, supporting the British with guns is okay, kind of hypocritical, but whatever, as well as embargoing Japan as they were being warlike. But they were against the war, entering the war themselves. Attacking Pearl Harbor made many of those anti-war supporters switch to pro-war, waking a giant that would pump out ships. Here's a quote from a source, a source that I'll put down below. 6 more aircraft carriers would join the Japanese Navy between 1942 and 1944, while the United States would launch 89 carriers of various sizes by the end of the conflict in August 1945. That was after the Battle of Midway, where 4 of the aircraft carriers, including the first aircraft carrier division, was disastrously destroyed with all 4 major ships. As you can see, 6 aircraft carriers produced by the Japanese, 89 by the Americans. Japan was vastly outmatched in industry, the ability to pump out men, as well as, they were low in resources. They could not afford much more fronts, but they opened one anyway. Why? Well, let me give you a quote by Unleashing the Force by Susan Townsend's Domestic Policy section. Quote, "By the time General Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister and the war against Japan began in 1941, the nation was in a state of total war. And the military and their supporters were able to force their policies on the government and the people. The military wanted more. They wanted more land, more resources. They wanted more anything." That was a lot on Pearl Harbor. Probably too much by accident, but let's continue on in Japan. The overall effect of Japan in this 1931 to 1941 period is an increase in militarism and extreme nationalism from these militarist factions such as the Kodaha, Tosaha, and others like it. All of them wanted more land, more resources, created instability with coups and attacks that weren't orders, such as the Muktin Incident, where the Prime Minister did not ask for this, nor did the Emperor asked for them to do these things, but they believed that the emperor desired it for some reason, so they did it. Declaring war in Manchuria, taking Manchuria, then in 1936 doing the same for China proper. Then in 1941 with Pearl Harbor. This was war. Japan wanted a war to gain more resources and power. Well, they got a war. From there, it was downhill. Japan would lose land, desperately trying to continue the fight, not losing land, try to get more resources. And then it fell. From midway, it kept on going and going, and then it finally ended with the 2 nuclear bombs dropping in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, putting an end to the Japanese imperialist ambitions. Let me finish off with one final quote from Unleashing Force by Susan Townsend. When the Japanese Kuomintang army contrived to invade Manchuria on the 18th of September 1931, it unleashed military and political forces which ultimately led to the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941.